Hi, this is Dutch Thompson with MP3. That stands for Move Past Pain to Performance. And we're live here with Dr. Ray Peat. Super excited, and it's such an honor it is to have Dr. Peat with us today. So, in introducing him, Dr. Peat has a PhD in biology with a specialization in physiology. He is a professor, researcher, author, consultant, and artist. He's helped people around the world with his research on environmental stressors, dietary nutrition, and hormones. And let me just check real quick here with our outside sound sources, and it looks like sound and systems are operational. So again, kind of here in way of introducing Dr. Peat, I became familiar with his work as I was studying for what I do, which is this Z Health neuroplasticity work. We look at the brain performance for body performance, and in one of the courses I took, Dr. Cobb, who is a chiropractic neurologist, began to describe how it's important to fuel the brain. It was the first time I kind of understood that it was perhaps more important to think about the food I was giving my brain than it was to consider the food I was giving my body. So it completely changed my perspective of how I thought about hunger or craving. How could I perhaps orient my body to want more of the things that were good for my brain? And then I was introduced to Dr. Ray Peat, and his work is amazing. Shortly after I started following his guidelines, I started feeling a lot better, a lot stronger, a lot more consistent energy. My wife began to sleep through the night. She'd struggled with sleep deprivation, sleeping maybe 1-2 hours a night for about 5 years, into 10 or so specialists. No one could help her. No medication could assist her. And when she started following Dr. Peat's guidelines, and we started understanding some of his ideas, she started sleeping through the night, which was a massive impact for our family, of course, as you can imagine. So I'm going to bring Dr. Peat into the room now. Dr. Peat, can you hear me? Okay, fantastic. And Dr. Peat is going to be joining us audio today. So thank you for joining us. Dr. Peat, tell us, if you would, please, a little bit about yourself. How did you get into this line of work?
In the early 60s, there was a very dogmatic attitude in academic linguistics and psychology. And I thought the objectivity of science would be the place to follow up my ideas. And so there were nerve biology professors at the University of Oregon, and I thought I would go there and study brain biology with them. But my first quarter enrolled in graduate school there, I realized that neurobiology was at least as dogmatic as academic linguistics and psychology. The idea of objectivity had nothing to do with what they were doing in nerve biology and brain research. So I looked around all of the different branches of the biology and molecular biology sections, and found that reproductive physiology, there was at least one professor who was guided by evidence doing actual exploratory research in how aging affects fertility. There were different sections, male and female, and I decided that the female side of reproduction would involve understanding also how aging and reproductive problems affected the developing ovum and embryo, and so in a way it incorporated what I was interested in, brain development. What are the factors in growing a brain and maintaining a brain? So reproductive physiology was what I specialized in, and especially the aging estrogen and thyroid in particular govern the energetic metabolism of all cells and influence the way the brain develops and functions and deteriorates. So it was something that I could continue to work on over the decades.
So you appeared really at a key time in history, really, because all of these things that you just mentioned began to be manipulated, you might say, for good or for evil. I don't know. But you were there to see things begin to be deleted from our diets, and these hormones took on a radically different pattern of development than we'd seen before our time. Could you respond to that?
Yeah. During my dissertation research, I found that excess of estrogen or deficiency of progesterone and thyroid created a physiological state that was, as far as I could see, was identical to what was created by an oxygen deficiency or a vitamin E deficiency or an excess of polyunsaturated fatty acids. And so I followed up the early research on unsaturated fats and how vitamin E was involved in that, and found that the early vitamin E researchers, the Phsyiologist family, had seen that it was protective against miscarriage and infertility. In fact, my dissertation advisor, Arnold Soderwall, had demonstrated in animals the same things that the Phsyiologists had demonstrated in women with fertility problems, that aging is equivalent in function to an estrogen excess rather than an estrogen deficiency. And high estrogen could be remedied by increasing vitamin E. The Phsyiologists used vitamin E first to cure infertility, and then for the rest of their careers used it to cure and prevent heart disease. And in both of these cases, it's protecting against the wastage of oxygen. And the food industry and the developing estrogen industry were not supportive of that line of research, because it suggested that both estrogen and polyunsaturated fats were toxic and age-promoting. And so the idea of vitamin E being nothing but an antioxidant was developed and spread through advertising and subsidized research, and that the myth of estrogen deficiency as the cause of menopause was promoted by the estrogen industry to sell estrogen. And so in the early 1940s, a lot of fraudulent research related to polyunsaturated fats, vitamin E, and estrogen started shaping medical consciousness.
So one of the reasons I love your work, Dr. Peat, is because you do just confront us a lot of statements or maybe truisms that we are tending to believe today. And what you say is in direct contradiction to many of the things we read, and I, for one, trust you instead. So in particular, when we look at vitamin E, as I look at, you can find lots of research that says it might be a really bad idea to take vitamin E. What do you think of that?
I put it in the category along with the growing research scaring doctors about using thyroid supplements. Both of these have such a broad therapeutic effect that it really impinged on the sale of drugs in all of those areas. Circulatory disease, reproductive disease, mental deterioration, all of the degenerative diseases are affected by both thyroid and vitamin E. And so naturally there's a big reaction against them by the pharmaceutical industry who fund the great majority of research.
Yep. Is there a dosage of vitamin E that you like or recommend?
No, I haven't kept up with what's currently going on. The pressure is always to have a cheaper product, and for about 50 or 60 years, people went along with the idea that vitamin E was nothing but an antioxidant, and so D-alpha tocopherol was the only thing they counted as vitamin E. But now there's growing recognition that the other isomers have at least as much value as the antioxidant fraction. The D-alpha isomer is only a small part of the function.
Do you take vitamin D, or is there a product that you like?
No, I pretty much stopped using it myself when the industry went through big changes about 15 years ago, and they started selling a lot of soy oil diluted vitamin E. So my rule of what I will ingest is that it should have a high potency rating, but it should also be mixed isomers, and it should be very viscous, not a runny clear yellow solution, meaning that it's probably diluted with soy oil.
So one of our friends, Georgi Dinkov, is probably, if he doesn't already have a product, he's probably will have one in the near future, I would imagine. So something else that we're, I guess in the stream of conversation that we're having now is there are some really cheap things that we can take that are really, really good for us. Vitamin E being one, but also aspirin. So could you tell us a little bit about your perspective on aspirin?
Yeah, aspirin was first it was demonized when the Tylenol company wanted to sell their product. It was already known to be liver toxic. Before they created the RISE syndrome, that was really an advertising campaign for Tylenol more than a real syndrome. For example, a study in Australia looked at cases diagnosed as RISE syndrome and found that they were more likely to have taken Tylenol than aspirin. So the whole thing, trying to teach women to give their kids Tylenol instead of aspirin, that was at least a big mistake, if not a big fraud.
So why is aspirin so great for us?
has lots of functions. It has been stereotyped as being a prostaglandin synthesis inhibitor, which is a very good function because all of the prostaglandins have toxic effects and we benefit from inhibiting their formation. But it has various functions besides that. Anti-inflammatory, protecting against nitric oxide, reducing all of the major promoters of inflammation, an antihistamine effect, for example, antioxidant effect even.
And you got into a little bit of the nitric oxide there. Can you tell us a little bit about nitric oxide and why that's bad for us?
In the years early 90s, when nitric oxide was discovered that it's produced in the body, not just by smog from car exhaust, but the body actually makes it. In the first years, it was identified as the promoter of several inflammatory and degenerative diseases. For example, in brain trauma, it's a major mediator and continuer of the damage caused by the brain injury. And blocking it will block progression of the brain injury. But as soon as it became associated with the vasodilation of erection, virility, the industry selling Viagra promoted a change in ideology, and suddenly when Viagra became a product, the mood changed and everyone was saying nitric oxide can be promoted by eating beets or various foods or supplements, taking arginine, for example, and it became almost a health food idea to promote the production of nitric oxide, but that only followed the industry of increasing virility. It didn't have a sound biological basis, and they're even using, for example, several years ago, I had a friend with pulmonary hypertension, and her doctor actually prescribed Viagra because it would supposedly open up blood vessels to the lungs, reduce the heart pressure, back pressure on the right ventricle. But actually she died, I think, much quicker for having the increased nitric oxide. And it became a fad for giving to newborn babies to improve their breathing. And so one of the things a lot of doctors were rushing to do was to give COVID virus patients nitric oxide to improve their breathing. It's absolutely toxic, and it probably is increased in most respiratory diseases because it's promoted by inflammation and causes the damage related to inflammation, increases fibrosis, and the after effect of the coronavirus is to leave a residue of fibrosis in the lungs that can only be increased by giving extra nitric oxide.
So nitric oxide is super unhealthy for us. It goes in line with it seems to be elevated when we experience disease or pathologies. Nitric oxide increases in our body.
Yeah, people have devised tests by which you can measure an increase in nitric oxide in your exhaled breath when you have cancer or asthma or a lot of serious systemic diseases. It escapes from the lungs in high enough concentration that it's like exhaling smog.
One of our viewers has asked if nitric oxide feeds viruses.
Yeah, that's a major argument by the proponents that our white blood cells are known to produce something like Clorox and nitric oxide, and so those are part of the equipment of white blood cells for killing things. But luckily they use them in the immediate vicinity. They make contact and they release nitric oxide and oxidized form of chlorine that is very reactive to basically disinfect what they touch. But when you try to use it systemically, unfortunately reacts more with the host than with the infection.
Right, so it would tend to make the virus worse?
No, it would actually tend to destroy the virus, but also, meanwhile, harming the patient.
I see. Okay. So this goes back to, I think I wanted to ask you about the Viagra type product. Is the harm or part of the harmful side effects that medication can actually cause erectile dysfunction?
Too much nitric oxide damages nerves, and what was covered up in that whole erectile function research system was that how the erection works is that testosterone activates, strengthens muscles that constrict around the veins leaving the penis, letting the inflow stay put inside the penis because the outflow is blocked by the supporting function that requires testosterone to strengthen those muscles and activate them. So they were really turning the process of erection upside down just to fit their product.
Okay. So there's several processes that I began to learn about when I started listening to you that seem to accumulate together. And of course, correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand there are these things that tend to increase in our bodies and can hold us in these disease states. Estrogen, adrenaline, cortisol, higher levels of oxygen relative to CO2, nitric oxide. Would you respond to that concept, please?
Did you include serotonin?
I did not. Yeah, that's.
These things all have an acute protective or activating function. If you are bitten by an insect or a dog or whatever and have tissue damage, there is release of histamine, serotonin, nitric oxide, and enzymes are activated, forming prostaglandins and estrogen, and all of these have a local function to stimulate cell growth, close up the wound, activate repair, and fill in with fibrous tissue if nothing better can be done. So you form a scar and maybe lose some function, but you've saved the organism. But when these finish doing their job, the more the organism can turn them off immediately, the better the wound closure is, and the less loss of function and the less filling in with useless scar tissue there is. So basically, you want to minimize their response, have an adequate local production, local in the sense of space and time both, local and immediate, but not continuing. In the case of the ovum, which is ready to implant, the implantation requires estrogen to, in effect, prepare a wound equivalent, and the ovum can enter the uterus through that excited, activated area. But then, if it's to survive and grow, a huge surge of estrogen supported by thyroid and carbon dioxide has to take place, knocking down the estrogen production. The whole idea of the birth control pill was established in the 1930s, that estrogen will cause miscarriage or non-implantation depending on how early the estrogen dominance occurs. My dissertation advisor, for example, showed that mating animals, if he increased their estrogen at earlier and earlier stages, or postponed it, he could either prevent implantation or cause early miscarriage, or right up to the day or two before normal birth, if he gave a big dose of estrogen, he would cause miscarriage. And vitamin E deficiency, by decreasing progesterone and increasing estrogen, have the same effect, either non-implantation or earlier or later miscarriage.
Okay, Dr. Peat, let me make sure that we have enough time here to get through the next series of questions. Since we got started a little bit late with our audio difficulties, do you have the freedom to go to 2:45 today?
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, so diving right back in. Estrogen, if I'm hearing you right, it's great to have enough, but most of us have too much. Is that true?
Well, not effectively too much, but too much in the wrong place. Everything stressful will tend to drive the respiratory system to work harder, and when the body is sensing energy deprivation, for example in diabetes, the cells aren't able to oxidize sugar, and so they sense energy deprivation, and signals of that sort caused by could be an estrogen excess or poisoning by too much polyunsaturated fats, or not enough of various respiratory system to make you breathe harder. And so typically, probably about at least a third of Americans have some sign of hyperventilation sitting at rest. For example, they will have a slight persisting elevation of lactic acid. Well-trained athletes often have such an excess of lactic acid that they will be habitually hyperventilating, and the lungs will be slightly inflamed as a result of the lactic acid and the overuse, and they will lose efficiency. So the oxygen isn't really getting where it's needed, but they're having signals that make them continue this overbreathing. And that's where the therapeutic effects of increased carbon dioxide come in, because the lactic acid is one of the main signals to turn on compensatory overbreathing, and carbon dioxide can, by being increased in the system beyond what the cells are able to produce, when they aren't oxidizing properly, they aren't making enough CO2. So adding some CO2 to your environment will allow your cells to stop producing so much lactic acid. And even though CO2 itself is a signal to breathe, it's a more true representation. But in the process of increasing the CO2 and lowering the lactic acid, you are reactivating the ability to use oxygen to produce energy. And so by taking a supplement of CO2, you're increasing your ability to make more CO2, and the overall effect is to make you able to retain more CO2 by not breathing so hard, despite the fact that CO2 is a signal to increase breathing. It at first seems contradictory, but it's actually reducing false signals and returning you to the normal relaxed state in which you don't breathe until you need the oxygen.
So again, I'm kind of wondering about the estrogen impact here. And are you saying that by getting a better balance or a higher level of CO2 in the body, that helps to keep estrogen in check?
Yeah, it's definitely one of the things. Estrogen is a major driver of hyperventilation and of ineffective oxidative metabolism. It in itself, one of its first actions is to increase lactic acid formation and waste sugar.
So one of the things that I really started to enjoy about your discussions, and I want to encourage all of our listeners right now to get in some time watching some of the YouTube videos and other places, podcasts where Dr. Peat is. He's just such a strong voice for body health, for brain health, and one of the things that I began to enjoy was you were speaking with a level of complexity around this stuff. And for the first time, I really began to understand the fact that my body was so much more like a chemistry lab than I had thought of before. Before I'd go to the grocery store and I would buy the food I felt like buying. I would buy what looked good. And then when I started listening to you, that completely changed. And I started to think, okay, what things am I putting in my body that are impacting me and my hormones? What things are increasing estrogen, influencing CO2, and the other mix of things. What things do I need to increase my testosterone? But it became a much more informed part of my life. So I'm thankful for that. There's been a couple of really important statements that you've made as I've listened to you over the past year and a half or two. One was that estrogen would tend to be a little out of control in the absence of some limiters like I think progesterone and pregnenolone. Is that correct?
Yeah, progesterone is the most direct antagonist of estrogen. It blocks some of the effects between estrogen and the cell substance, but it also knocks out the official protein called the estrogen receptor. It causes that to actually degrade and inhibits enzymes that would continue to activate estrogen. It shifts the activity, for example, to convert estradiol, the powerful estrogen, to estrone, the inactive estrogen, and to activate the enzyme system that transfers sulfate and glucuronic acid onto the estrogen molecule, making it water soluble so it leaves the cell and then leaves the body in the urine or bile. And it inactivates the aromatase enzyme that inhibits it. So I've counted around a dozen specific enzymes that are activated or inactivated in exactly the right way to eliminate estrogen. It's hard to imagine how a single molecule, progesterone, can have such a highly organized, systematic effect to relieve the body of that one molecular system, the estrogen system.
Yeah, I've was recently made familiar with some of the research I think happening with concussions or TBI, traumatic brain injury, and using progesterone as a early aid or supplement to help overcome that, and they've had a lot of success. Is that your understanding?
Yep. Estrogen, like cortisol, they travel together. Cortisol increases estrogen, and estrogen directly and indirectly increases cortisol. And depression increases both of those. And so progesterone is also the antagonist of cortisol. And so basically all of the endocrine effects associated with depression and anxiety are protected against by progesterone. Did you hear about the Science News article recently that observed that progesterone is effective against the COVID virus?
I did not. Wow. Okay. Amazing. Now you have a really, I think it's the only product that you've made, and that's the Progest product. Is that correct?
Yeah. I in 1976 started seeing women who fit the research that I had done for my dissertation, and realized that doctors were absolutely unwilling to make available to them what they obviously needed.
Wow.
Occasionally they would inject them with progesterone dissolved in benzyl alcohol and cottonseed oil or sesame seed oil.
Not good.
Both of the solvents are extremely toxic, but despite that, the progesterone would protect against the toxins and relieve their symptoms. I saw a woman who had had MS or optic neuritis along with the other symptoms of multiple sclerosis and had been bedridden and effectively blind and incompetent for on and off for more than a year. And on the strength of injected progesterone, she was recovered sufficiently that she drove to Portland, and my endocrinology class was on, I think it was the third floor of an old building, and she walked up 3 floors and gave an hour lecture to my naturopathic medical students on progesterone after being considered a terminal case.
Wow.
So I started looking for ways that women could use it without having to take the toxic injection that so few doctors were willing to give. And tried lots of different solvents that would make it effective orally or through the skin. And for a while, I would give women a jar of coconut oil or olive oil or some vegetable oil, but it would only stay in solution about 24 hours, and then it would cloud up and gradually sediment. And as soon as it was clouding up, that was meaning that it was crystalline and was no longer in solution and was becoming ineffective. And finally, I found that vitamin E was a safe and stable solvent.
Which is what it's in your product, Progest-E. And you can find out more about that at my website. I've got Dr. Peat's product posted there and where you can get it. And that's at mp3-theratrain.com. But I use that daily. Most of my clients use it, and I have them get it because it's just so incredibly good for our body. There, to summarize kind of a few points of where we've been, there are some things that are amazing for our body. It's fantastic for us to get some very inexpensive items into our system. We're having very high level of difficulty getting these because of the way foods are processed today, because of the foods that we're eating. But Progest-E is amazing. Just plain old uncoated aspirin is amazing. Higher dose probably is the 325, I think, is what I would recommend. Does that sound okay, Dr. Peat?
What was that?
I was suggesting that higher dose aspirin, the adult tab, might be a good protocol for most people.
Anything with safe diluents or excipients. I the pure crystals, aspirin USP. They sell it for animals and whatnot. It only costs about $15 a pound is the typical price.
Okay, but do you think that adult dose is probably a healthy general place to start for most of the population, adult population?
Yeah, anything that doesn't have silica in the tablet, for example.
Right. Which is, again, just really want to celebrate you and your work. If you listen to Dr. Peat Long, there's definitely consistent themes that you're going to hear. So many of the supplements that we do have access today are problematic because they have weird stuff in them. Powders, silica, things that are silicone dioxide that are really harmful for us. So if we're trying to put something good in our body and we're putting something in that's bad at the same time, of course, that's going to be more toxic for us. So, Dr. Peat, something I really want to touch on today, and then I know that we also want to touch on the COVID-19 as it's developed around us, and some very interesting things with that in our world. But before we go that direction, if you could speak to the hypothyroidism epidemic that we're facing.
Rhoda Barnes was a PhD thyroid researcher in the 1930s who then later got a medical degree and practiced based on his early research on thyroid. He studied hypothyroidism in Eastern Europe and a bad diet, high cabbage intake was the common basic diet, and cabbage contains anti-thyroid agents, and he saw a very high mortality from both cancer and heart disease, also breast cancer in those areas, and as soon as the person was given either a better diet or a thyroid supplement, they didn't succumb to those diseases. And he did animal research backing up how it works, showed that hypothyroidism, if you take out a person's thyroid gland, immediately their cholesterol rises. And if you supplement thyroid, just as immediately the cholesterol returns to normal. And so in 1936, he had already knocked out the cholesterol theory of heart disease. And it's really the hypothyroid explanation for heart disease. The hypothyroid blood vessel partly inflamed by the action of elevated TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, is an irritant to all tissues, and the high level in the blood when a person is hypothyroid is part of the damaging of the blood vessels. In defense, the cells go through many reactions, and all of that precedes the collection of the thyroid-rich plaque. Hypothyroidism is basically as epidemic as is atherosclerotic heart disease. And the cancer incidence is the other side. The hypothyroid populations, if they don't die of heart disease, cancer gets them, especially breast cancer, because when your thyroid function is low, your estrogen to progesterone ratio is very high. One of the first people I saw that got me interested in finding a progesterone supplement was a woman who had been completely disabled from the age of about 36 until 54. She was bedridden most of the day and wasn't allowed out of the house because she couldn't find her way home from supposedly the effects of epilepsy on her brain. Her estrogen was higher than her progesterone in any of the blood tests she had. For a healthy person has from 20 to 100 times as much progesterone as estrogen. Her estrogen was actually higher than the progesterone, keeping her brain in a constantly overstimulated, de-energized state. She dipped her fingers in my warm solution of progesterone in vegetable oil, and the small amount she absorbed through her arthritic fingers, she did that several times a day, soaking up progesterone probably spread some of it around her other skin, but that was a very moderate amount of progesterone supplement. In 5 days, she came back all by herself, out of the house, several blocks away from home, and grinning and bending her fingers that had been arthritic. And from then on, she wasn't bedridden again. Within a few weeks, went back to graduate school, got straight A's for a master's degree in gerontology. So her brain was not at all damaged by the seizures. It was just the estrogen was making it unable to function.
It's I'm both mixed with so much encouragement and yet also frustration at hearing you describe things like this, because I of course wonder of so many people who are struggling with brain problems, inability to move, inability to function, inability to think, brain fog, and yet your product is cheap. It's affordable. It's maybe $30 for a supply that's lasting me 2 to 3 months. So it's.
And if a person is supplementing their thyroid and eating an ideal diet, a young person, a woman in her 30s or 40s, for example, who seems to be heading towards menopause, just taking a dose to support her normal luteal phase cycle, often she will reestablish her own cycles and not need to supplement. It has a restorative effect on the ovaries and other progesterone tissue.
Yeah.
The brain is a major source of progesterone production, and progesterone supports the synthesis of progesterone.
In your opinion, what's the best thing that we can do as individuals to avoid hypothyroidism in our 30s or 40s?
Cutting out the polyunsaturated vegetable oils that were advertised as essential fatty acids. They're essential for disease, nothing else. Totally removing those from the diet, and pretty much the foods that contain them.
Yeah.
Grains and legumes, and all of the manufactured food products that have added fats.
Yeah. Dr. Peat, if I could interrupt you for a second, but every now and then you say something that's so amazing and mind-blowing. And this is one that I just wanted to capture, because I think you just said that there are no essential fatty acids.
There are some articles on my website, probably half a dozen, that go over the arguments that have been presented, and they're all essentially based on imaginary, non-existent things that they refer to. And it takes a long time to unwind all of the arguments that are given to explain where that idea that they're essential came from. George Burr, in 1929 to the early 30s, was pushing that argument. Other people had demonstrated that a fat-free diet extends life and prevents cancer and so on. He created the argument that they are essential to prevent skin disease. But 15 years later, the same skin disease was produced by a diet deficient in vitamin B6 and zinc, for example, and on a totally fat-free diet, these symptoms were cured by a supplement of vitamin B6. don't know what they were really deficient in. He said they were deficient in certain fatty acids. But when he put some of these deficient animals under a bell jar and measured their rate of oxygen consumption, they were consuming oxygen at 50% higher than normal animals. They were like they've been given a big overdose of thyroid.
Wow.
They were super metabolizers, super oxidative metabolizers. He was unknowingly demonstrating the powerful anti-thyroid effect of the essential fatty acids.
Wow. Yeah. So basically, like you said, the most important thing we can do to change the health of our thyroid and give us a better grasp or potential for health in the future is to avoid PUFAs, polyunsaturated fats. And the list of those is long. You can find all kinds of charts on polyunsaturated fats on Google search engines, but mainly what we're saying is your coconut oil is good and safe and has little or no polyunsaturated fat in it.
Butter is safe.
Butter is safe. Olive oil is okay. It's not great. Is that right?
Yeah, in moderation. It has about 10% of the PUFA, so you don't want to eat it chronically in significant amounts just for flavor.
Yeah. But if you think about this was so frustrating to me because I looked at every bag of chips on the grocery store shelf. Every single one is based in PUFA oils. So you cannot walk down the potato chip aisle and buy a potato chip bag of anything that's not toxic. There might be one brand that I can recommend. It's Boulder, I think coconut oil and sea salt, but that's it. Dr. Peat, if it's okay with you, let's kind of dive into the COVID-19 and take a few minutes with that. I know on this note, Dr. Peat has a monthly newsletter you can subscribe to. The email for that is, I think, raypeatnewsletter@raypeat.com. Is that right?
Yeah, Ray Peat's with an S.
Ray Peat's newsletter at raypeat.com. How much?
No, at gmail.com.
Okay. And that is it $28 for 2 years?
Right.
Okay, so that is an unbelievable value. One of the things that you will get from Dr. Peat is a tremendous value for minimal investment. That's 2 years of monthly newsletters, and the one he's working.
No, they're bi-monthly.
Okay, every other month. Thank you for your correction. But the next one he's working on is on the COVID-19 issues that we're facing. So, Dr. Peat, if you can discuss that some, that would be wonderful.
Starting in March and continuing through April, I began looking at the CDC's weekly reports of hospitalization and deaths from flu-like illnesses, along with their total mortality. Given weekly, I looked back to the beginning of the year and all the way through 2019 and several preceding years, and saw that basically, according to the CDC's mortality figures, nothing up to their latest figures, early April, basically nothing was happening out of the ordinary. And looking around the internet, I see quite a few people working in hospitals are saying the same. One of the first that I saw was Wolfgang Vodard in Germany, saying essentially the same thing. radio saying hospitals are empty. They aren't seeing anything happening, even though California was supposedly having an overflow of respiratory disease patients. And the high mortality partly is the result of very inappropriate treatment, even though, according to the CDC, I didn't see any figures of high mortality, but people working in these areas are saying that the mortality in some of the intensive care units is as high as 100% of those come in don't go out alive. A doctor in Germany, Luciano Godinoni, described two hospitals near him, I think in Berlin. One of the hospitals had a 60% mortality from the coronavirus, which resembled a lot of other intensive care units. But one nearby hospital had 0% mortality at that time. He said the hospital with 0% mortality had stopped giving the standard intubation ventilator treatment and was giving a nasal cannula oxygen instead, and not injuring their lungs just for a beginning of therapy. Better not kill the patient before they're able to recover.
So what was wrong with the intubation that was that you're describing? Why is that insufficient or harmful?
I just saw a video by I think a New York nurse describing doctors who were giving extreme overpressures. She called it blowing out their lungs. But there are lots of problems that can happen when intubation is too intense, either too much pressure or too fast, too much oxygen. The concentrated oxygen beyond the normal air causes fairly rapid damage to the lungs, destruction of the lungs, if you continue it with a very high concentration. So almost everything can go wrong with an intubated patient. And so Gabinoni was saying that a very conservative kind of respiratory treatment was failing to kill the patients.
Okay. So what are the other challenges? What are the other thoughts that you have around this global pandemic? There's all sorts of extremist language that are used to describe this. So
when I couldn't find any evidence of an increased respiratory disease mortality all the way up to early April, I started looking into the background and why were they saying there was a pandemic when there weren't even very many tests being given and validated tests. No one knew whether any test at all was verified as a measure of whether this particular virus is present. And even if it's present, why did they think it was going to be a pandemic, super infectious and a high mortality per infection?
Right.
There was no data at all before they started putting out these ideas. Absolutely no meaningful scientific information. Two doctors at Stanford, for example, Jay Bhattacharya was one who wrote an article in, I think it was Wall Street Journal, saying just that where's the information for creating a panic? As far as he could see, nothing was happening. And when you look farther into it, you see that the idea of a pandemic had been proposed in a meeting organized by Johns Hopkins University, World Economic Forum, and the Gates Foundation, proposing that an imported bat-derived coronavirus infection would create a pandemic in the United States, maybe kill 2.5 or 2.2 million people. That was discussed in last fall, before there was any hint of a Chinese virus. But the plan was all ready, and the thought was in everyone's mind in the government that there could be a pandemic, it could kill millions, and so with no evidence except at the end of December and in January, finally the Chinese gave the chemical description of this virus. Within days, it was announced that a deadly pandemic was underway. Absolutely no basis on the level of reality and the information to make those statements. And meanwhile, nothing was showing up in the CDC's mortality, hospitalization, and infection rates. What did show up was a shift as influenza identified lung infections decreased. Exactly, the coronavirus identified infections increased. So the curve of infections stayed the same. And this was during a time when doctors were being advised to diagnose, when in doubt, diagnose coronavirus as the cause of death.
Right.
So people were simply inclined not to make a guess that it was influenza, but rather coronavirus that was causing the death. So the propaganda and language change explains a lot of it, but irrational panicking propaganda statements, I think, is clearly what was happening in January, February, and March.
Has this damaged the WHO's credibility?
Oh, if you look at the history of the WHO, it's only a little better than the CDC, and a lot of the same people go back and forth between the U.S. Public Health Service, CDC, and World Health Organization. And I've been following the credibility of the CDC for about 60 years. I got interested in the lies they were putting out regarding radiation damage from nuclear fallout in the 1950s. That several cover-ups, 1953, 1957, early 60s, and then later the 1979 Three Mile Island radiation leak. They were just causing the real data to disappear and putting out happy statements. Nothing has happened. So for real public health emergencies, they were saying everything is fine. Don't leave the area. Don't save yourself from the radiation exposure. So the 1976 swine flu. Everyone should look at a CBS program. I think that program was in '79. Phil Donahue had the CDC's head of the influenza vaccine section. He was in charge of evaluating influenza vaccines for several years, and he kept telling his superiors that the vaccine would do more harm than protection. Finally, when the swine flu vaccine was being put through and about to go public, he went against his supervisors who were ignoring him and went on the Phil Donahue television program and explained the absolute absence of safety evidence and the evidence that it would be neurotoxic. Later, CBS 60 Minutes program did a good evaluation of what had happened and showed that the swine flu epidemic never happened, was a total fraud, and caused thousands of paralytic diseases and many deaths. So looking back at the public health agencies, in the U.S., there are a uniformed service parallel to the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, etc., and they follow orders, and insubordination is a big thing. So science doesn't have any place in those organizations. It's all authority and obedience.
Yeah. So this is such a exciting conversation, and I love everything that you have to say, Dr. Peat. Let's move toward wrapping up here. We've gone overtime. I'm so thankful again that you've joined me. I know we could go for another 5 hours and not even scratch the surface on what we could potentially get into. So thank you so much for joining us. Again, there are a lot of podcasts and opportunities to hear Dr. Ray Peat. The issues at hand that we're discussing on best medical care and why we might not be able to get it due to misinformation or due to companies that may be seeking their profit beyond our well-being. These are obvious things that we wrestle with, but you want to listen to Dr. Peat to get an idea of how you can become your own healthcare professional, your own body doctor, so to speak, so you can take care of yourself and be educated about these things. Dr. Peat, thank you again for joining us. Do you have any last comments before we sum up here?
No. Thank you for doing the program.
I am so thankful again. Thank you for helping my wife sleep through the night. Thank you for helping so many of my clients. I think you are just an amazing person, and I hope many of our watchers, our viewers, are able to benefit from this dialogue today. And I hope I can have you on again sometime and visit with you some more. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Bye.